The precise hum of the ventilation system was a constant companion in the archives of the research station, a low, steady thrum that Blake had long ceased to consciously register. Here, amidst towering shelves of sealed documents, meticulously labeled boxes, and climate-controlled storage units, Blake found a profound sense of order. Each item possessed its designated place, a record of observation, analysis, or historical data waiting to be accessed. Blake's work was the preservation of this order, the meticulous indexing and recataloguing of forgotten sections, ensuring no fragment of information truly vanished into obscurity. This particular morning, the air carried the faint, dry scent of aged paper and a sterile chemical tang, a familiar olfactory signature of the deepest levels of the station. Blake moved with an practiced economy of motion, the soft rubber soles of their shoes barely disturbing the polished concrete floor. They wore a standard-issue gray jumpsuit, its fabric resistant to dust and static, and a pair of thin, lint-free gloves. Today's task involved the subsection Gamma 7, a rarely accessed collection of geological surveys and anthropological field notes from an expedition nearly a century past. The original cataloging, Blake noted with a professional frown, had been less than rigorous. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a cool, even glow, illuminating the rows of identical, reinforced steel shelves. He ran a gloved hand along a spine, feeling the slight vibration of the shelving unit. The systematic nature of the work was a balm, a quiet defiance against the vast, chaotic expanse of the unknown. Each box opened, each document reviewed, was a small victory for clarity. Blake began with the uppermost shelf, carefully extracting a heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle. Dust, fine as flour, puffed into the air, catching the light for a fleeting moment before settling again. Inside, a collection of brittle parchment maps and a leather-bound journal. The contents were predictable: geological strata, topographical contours, sketches of ancient pottery. He scanned the faded script, cross-referencing against the preliminary manifest. Everything aligned. Hours passed in quiet, focused concentration. The rhythmic turning of pages, the soft click of the scanner, the faint whisper of Blake's own breath in the still air. The determination that drove he was not born of ambition, but of a deep-seated need for structure, for understanding the world through its documented fragments. To leave a record uncatalogued, a piece of information adrift, felt like a personal failing. It was in the 10th box, labeled simply Miscellaneous Field Samples, Unidentified, that the anomaly first surfaced. The box itself was unremarkable, a standard gray polymer container, but its weight was disproportionate to its size, denser than expected for a collection of small rocks or soil samples. Blake noted the discrepancy, a minor deviation, but one that nudged at the edges of their meticulous expectations. Inside, nestled amongst several small, unremarkable rock specimens, was an object unlike anything he had ever encountered in the archives. It was roughly ovular, fitting comfortably in the palm of a hand, and made of a material that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Its surface was a matte, featureless black, utterly devoid of texture or seam. There were no markings, no etchings, no identifying characteristics whatsoever. It felt cool to the touch, not cold, but with an inert, unsettling temperature that seemed to resist the ambient warmth of Blake's gloved hand. He turned it over, slowly, searching for any clue, a faint stamp, a microscopic imperfection, a hint of its origin or purpose. Nothing. It was perfectly smooth, perfectly uniform. It had no weight in the conventional sense, yet it possessed a profound, almost gravitational density. Blake felt a faint, prickling sensation on their fingertips, a phantom vibration that seemed to emanate from within the object itself, rather than from any external source. A quiet unease began to unfurl in his chest. This was not a misplaced document, or a poorly labeled specimen. This was an object that defied categorization entirely. It simply was. Blake consulted the manifest for the box again, then the broader catalog for subsection Gamma 7. No entry for an unidentified ovular object, black, inert. No mention in any of the field notes he had reviewed. It was as if it had simply appeared. Blake held the object up, closer to the light. The matte black surface seemed to drink in the fluorescent glow, refusing to yield any secrets. A faint, high-pitched whine, almost imperceptible, seemed to resonate deep within Blake's skull, a sound like a distant, dying star. He blinked, shaking their head slightly. The whine vanished, the edges of the room snapped back into focus. It must have been the ventilation, or perhaps a momentary lapse in concentration. The archives were, after all, a place of profound quiet. Yet, the faint, internal vibration persisted, a subtle tremor that seemed to emanate bypass the gloves, reaching directly into the bones of Blake's hand. The object felt. Not alien, not supernatural, but fundamentally wrong. It was a perfect, silent negation of everything Blake's work stood for. He carefully placed the object on the clean, sterile surface of the workbench. It sat there, utterly inert, yet its presence seemed to warp the very quiet of the room, drawing attention, demanding an explanation it refused to offer. And the breach had come from within. He stared at the object, a determined archivist confronting a blank page that promised no answers, only a deepening, silent question. The artifact. Blake held it now, not in the archives, but at their personal workstation in a quieter section of the research station, a small, enclosed space with a single monitor and an array of older, more specialized readers. The ventilation hum was less pronounced here, replaced by the soft whir of the computer's internal fan. The object was not large, fitting comfortably in one palm, a smooth, dark stone-like material, obsidian perhaps, but with a peculiar lack of reflection. Its surface absorbed light rather than deflecting it, rendering its contours strangely indistinct under the harsh overhead fluorescent glow. What truly arrested Blake was its texture. Not cold, not warm, but present. There were no discernible markings, no carvings, nothing to suggest human origin or purpose. Yet, it felt ancient, impossibly so, carrying a weight that belied its size. Blake had found it tucked away in a mislabeled archival box, marked simply Miscellaneous Geologic Samples, Sector 7. A gross oversight, or perhaps, a deliberate concealment. They powered on the older microfiche reader, its bulb flickering to life with a faint, dusty smell. The research station's digital database was extensive, but some of the deepest, most obscure records still resided on physical media, rarely accessed, and often poorly indexed. Blake began with a broad search: unusual geological finds, anomalous materials, pre-human artifacts. The results were voluminous, mostly irrelevant, but Blake worked with a quiet tenacity, driven by a growing, unsettling curiosity. Hours bled into one another. The screen's blue light cast a pallor on Blake's face. The artifact sat on the desk beside the keyboard, an inert sentinel. Sometimes, Blake would glance at it, and for a fleeting moment, the edges of their vision seemed to blur, the solid lines of the workstation's partitions wavering, only to snap back into focus. A trick of tired eyes, Blake reasoned, rubbing their temples. The isolation of the research station was profound, particularly in the off hours when most personnel had retreated to their dormitories or left the facility entirely. The long corridors were silent, save for the distant hum and the occasional clang of an HVAC system settling. Then, a hit. Not a direct match, but a tangential reference within a digitized log from a defunct geological survey team, dated nearly a century ago. The entry was brief, almost. An aside, detailing a dig site in a remote, unnamed canyon. Found a peculiar stone today. Emits a subtle, non-thermal resonance. Team leader dismissed it as igneous anomaly. Filed with standard samples. The log then veered back to stratigraphic analysis. Blake picked up the artifact again, turning it over in their fingers. The pressure was still there, a phantom vibration. They placed it on a small, portable sensor array, usually reserved for testing atmospheric particulates. The readings were baffling. No electromagnetic output, no heat, no discernible radiation beyond background levels. Yet, the sensor registered something, a faint, almost imperceptible fluctuation in the ambient energy field, like a ripple in still water, too subtle to be categorized by the machine's parameters. Blake searched for the survey team. The team had been disbanded shortly after that expedition. Their records were fragmented, incomplete. Blake's breath hitched. The digital archives yielded another fragment, a heavily redacted report from an internal security review, decades old. It mentioned a containment protocol failure related to anomalous materials and a subsequent psychological impact assessment on personnel involved. The details were obscured, but the context was clear. Whatever this artifact was, it had a history of causing distress, perhaps worse. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the corridor. Blake flinched, dropping the artifact. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, making no sound of impact, simply absorbing the force. Blake stared at it, then at the door, heart thrumming in uneven rhythm. It was probably just the building settling, or a distant maintenance drone. This was not a geological sample. This was something else entirely, something that had been hidden, forgotten, and for good reason. A new thought, insidious and unwelcome, began to worm its way into Blake's mind. Had the blurring vision been just tiredness? Had the faint crack been the building, or something else? The idea that their own perceptions might be compromised, that their mind was beginning to fray at the edges, was far more terrifying than any external threat. The face staring back was pale, eyes wide, a stranger's face. The hum of the station seemed to grow louder, or was it only in their head? Blake had to know more, even if the knowing cost them everything. The artifact lay on the cool, synthetic surface of Blake's workstation, a presence more than an object. It was roughly the size of a human fist, carved from a material that absorbed light rather than reflected it, its surface a matte, obsidian black. Blake ran a gloved finger over its contours, tracing the intricate, non-Euclidean patterns etched into its form. The ventilation hum in this quiet corner of the research station seemed to flatten, the usual background drone losing its texture, becoming a singular, featureless tone. Blake activated the optical scanner, a relic from an earlier generation of archival equipment. Its low-intensity beam swept across the artifact, projecting an image onto the monitor. The display flickered, then stabilized, showing the patterns magnified. They were not merely decorative, they possessed a terrifying internal logic, lines twisting back on themselves, forming impossible geometries that seemed to shift even as Blake watched. A subtle nausea bloomed in their stomach, a low thrumming that resonated with the artifact's silent emanations. "Analyze primary structural integrity," Blake murmured, their voice unnaturally loud in the small enclosure. The workstation's internal diagnostics whirred, attempting to categorize the material. The readout flashed, "Unknown composition. Anomalous energy signature detected. Recommend isolation protocol." Blake ignored it. They leaned closer, their eyes fixated on a particular cluster of glyphs that seemed to writhe on the screen. The air in the research station grew heavy, thick with an unidentifiable scent, like ozone mixed with something ancient and mineral. The hum of the ventilation system intensified, then abruptly warped, stretching into a low, mournful wail that vibrated through the floor. Blake flinched, glancing around the empty workstation, but the sound was internal, a pressure behind their eardrums. Blake pressed a sequence of keys, calling up a comparative database of ancient languages and symbols. Nothing matched. The artifact's script was utterly alien, yet it felt familiar, like a forgotten memory trying to surface. A flicker in their peripheral vision. Blake turned their head sharply. The wall panel, usually a uniform gray, seemed to ripple, its surface momentarily taking on the texture of distressed leather before snapping back to normal. Blake blinked, shaking their head. Just fatigue, they told themselves. Long hours in the archives did strange things to the mind. But the feeling persisted. The edges of their vision blurred, and the precise lines of the workstation's console seemed to waver, softening, then sharpening with an unnatural clarity. Blake felt a cold prickle on their skin, despite the regulated temperature of the research station. They reached for a stylus, intending to make a note, but their hand felt heavy, alien. This isn't right," Blake whispered, their voice strained. They forced themselves to focus on the artifact. The patterns on the screen were now moving, not just shifting, but rearranging themselves. What had been a static image was now a flowing, dynamic sequence of symbols, like liquid geometry. This was beyond fatigue, beyond suggestion. This was real. A high-pitched whine began to emanate directly from the artifact, a sound that bypassed their ears and resonated in their bones. The light in the workstation dimmed, then brightened, pulsing in an erratic rhythm that echoed the patterns on the screen. Blake's heart hammered, a frantic drum against their ribs. They had to understand. They had to. The moment their skin made contact, a surge of pure, unfiltered information flooded their mind. It wasn't images, or sounds, or words. The workstation around them dissolved. Blake saw, not with their eyes, but with their mind, glimpses of impossible structures, geometries that defied all known physics, vast and silent, drifting through an eternal, lightless ocean. This was the reveal. This was the raw, unvarnished truth. The artifact wasn't just a key, it was a window. And through that window, something vast and ancient was staring back. It wasn't an entity with eyes or limbs, but a fundamental, cosmic presence that existed in the spaces between perception, a horror so profound it threatened to unravel the very threads of Blake's being. Blake screamed, a sound that was lost in the cacophony of their unraveling mind. They squeezed their eyes shut, but the visions persisted, etched onto the inside of their eyelids, more real than the workstation they had left behind. They were falling, not through space, but through layers of reality, each one peeling away to reveal another, more terrifying truth. Blake understood now. This wasn't just an object, it was a conduit. And it was open. The obsidian artifact, cool and inert moments before, pulsed under Blake's gloved finger. It wasn't a light it emitted, but an absence, a deeper shade of black that seemed to drink the ambient illumination of the research station's lab. A faint tremor ran through the surface, not mechanical, but organic, like a muscle contracting beneath a taut membrane. Blake's breath caught, a thin, sharp sound in the sterile quiet. Then, the tremor intensified, resonating up Blake's arm, a frequency that bypassed bone and tissue, settling directly into the core of their being. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights warped, stretching into a low, guttural drone. The pristine white walls of the lab began to ripple, their edges blurring, as if seen through heated air. Blake blinked, shaking their head, but the distortion persisted. The analytical instruments on the adjacent bench, usually static and precise, seemed to lean, their chrome surfaces reflecting elongated, impossible versions of the room. A wave of nausea washed over Blake, not from motion sickness, but from a profound disorientation of space. The floor beneath their feet felt less like solid concrete and more like shifting sand. They stumbled back from the workstation, gripping the edge of the steel table to steady themselves. The artifact, still on the synthetic surface, now appeared to be breathing, expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the frantic beating of Blake's own heart. "What is this?" Blake murmured, the words feeling alien in their own mouth, their voice a stranger's inflection. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. It wasn't cold, nor warm, but a pressure that seemed to press against Blake's eardrums, muffling the world. The drone deepened, becoming a chorus of whispers that tickled the edges of their hearing, just beyond comprehension. When Blake opened their eyes, the room had subtly changed. The angles of the ceiling seemed wrong, the corners sharper, the walls no longer perpendicular. One moment, a stranger's wide, terrified eyes stared back, the next, an ancient, impassive visage, etched with lines of incomprehensible age. Blake recoiled, their reflection dissolving into a swirl of gray static, then reforming, this time showing Blake, but with a profound, unsettling emptiness behind their own eyes. The artifact pulsed again, a deeper, more resonant thrum. With each beat, a fragment of Blake's self seemed to peel away. Memories, once solid anchors, became fluid, merging with sensations that were not their own. This wasn't a vision, it was a memory, a primordial echo embedded deep within their own being, suddenly awakened. The shifting identities in the monitor were not hallucinations, they were possibilities, echoes of what Blake could be, or had been, or was meant to be. The artifact was not merely an object of study, it was a key, and Blake, by touching it, had become the lock, the conduit. The lab, once a sanctuary of scientific order, twisted into a labyrinth of non-Euclidean angles. The floor undulated. The ceiling stretched to an impossible height, then pressed down, threatening to crush them. Blake stumbled, falling to their knees, their hands splayed on the vibrating concrete. They looked up, desperate for a familiar face, a rational presence. A colleague, the researcher from the biocontainment unit, stood by the doorway, their back to Blake. "It's done," the colleague's voice echoed, devoid of inflection, resonant with an immense, ancient power. "The aperture is open." Blake tried to speak, to call out, to ask what they meant. Their throat was dry. The words caught, turning into a strangled gasp. The colleague turned slowly. Their face was not the familiar, kindly face Blake knew. Dormant. Waiting. We just needed a vessel. A bridge. The figure raised a hand, and the research station dissolved. Walls melted into a swirling vortex of impossible colors. The ceiling became an infinite, starless night. Blake was no longer on the floor, but suspended in a vast, silent emptiness, the artifact pulsing at the center of their chest, its rhythm now their own heartbeat. It was the fundamental, underlying reality. It was the truth of existence, finally made manifest, and Blake was not merely observing it, but had become an intrinsic part of its monstrous awakening. Their identity, their sanity, their very concept of self, had been nothing more than a thin veil, now shredded by the raw, indifferent truth of what lay beneath. And the most horrifying reveal of all, they had always been destined for this. They were not an archivist uncovering a forgotten past, but a necessary component in its terrifying, inevitable return. The cool, sterile air of the research station's central archive did little to soothe the tremor that now ran through Blake. Not a tremor of fear, but of an immense, almost unbearable anticipation. The high-ceilinged room, usually a bastion of ordered knowledge, now seemed to ripple at its edges, the rows of data servers humming with a frequency Blake alone could perceive. The fluorescent lights flickered, not physically, but within the periphery of Blake's vision, casting lone, wavering shadows that defied their fixed positions. Blake stood before the main console, the artifact, or what remained of its influence, pulsing a faint, internal light within the system's core. Blake's fingers, steady despite the profound shift in their being, hovered over the interface. Every fragment of their past, every memory of a life once lived, felt like a distant echo, a story told about someone else. The archivist Blake, the individual with a name and a history, was thinning, stretching, becoming porous. They felt less like a person and more like a conduit, a vessel meticulously prepared for a purpose they were only now beginning to comprehend. The determination that gripped them was not born of courage, but of an inexorable pull, a gravitational force drawing them to the precipice of truth. The console screen, typically displaying complex data streams, now showed only a single, expanding symbol. It was not a language, nor a diagram, but an arrangement of lines and curves that defied logical interpretation, yet resonated with an undeniable, ancient significance. Blake had seen it before, in fleeting glances, in the periphery of their mind's eye, a pattern woven into the fabric of the artifact's fragmented existence. Now, it was clear, vibrant, and demanding. This wasn't data to be processed, it was a gateway. With a slow, deliberate motion, Blake touched the screen. The surface, usually cool glass, felt warm, almost alive, beneath their fingertips. A jolt, not electrical, but existential, surged through them. The research station's walls seemed to fall away, the ceiling dissolving into an expanse of impossible color. The humming of the servers intensified, morphing into a chorus of whispers, each voice a facet of a singular, vast consciousness that had always been present, patiently waiting. The revelation wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, horrifying unfurling. Blake did not see a creature, nor a distant galaxy, but rather perceived the fundamental structure of reality. It was not built upon physics or mathematics, but on an endless, self-consuming dream, a thought given form by an entity so immense, so utterly indifferent, that human existence was less than a fleeting spark. The artifact had not revealed this entity, it had merely allowed Blake to witness the true nature of the dream, and the thin, fragile membrane separating it from the waking nightmare. The horror was the realization that the world, all of it, was merely a temporary configuration of an infinite, unknowable mind, and that mind was stirring. Blake felt their own consciousness stretching, thinning, losing its discrete boundaries. Memories, emotions, the very concept of I began to fray, like threads unraveling from a tapestry. They were not disappearing, not dying in the conventional sense, but rather expanding, dissolving into the vastness of this foundational dream. The individual Blake, the archivist who sought knowledge, was becoming part of the knowledge itself, a single, infinitesimal ripple in the ocean of cosmic thought. They were a lens, then a fragment, then merely a perception within the greater whole. There was no pain, only an overwhelming sense of absolute, terrifying belonging. Their unique perspective, their singular existence, ceased to matter, absorbed into the colossal indifference. When the last flicker of Blake's individual awareness had attenuated, the research station settled back into its quiet hum. The fluorescent lights ceased their spectral dance, casting an even, unwavering glow across the empty archive. The console screen reverted to its default standby display, the intricate, demanding symbol gone as if it had never been. The air, once charged with an unseen current, felt merely cool and sterile. Everything was as it had been. The horror had not left. It had simply found its way in, silently, seamlessly, becoming just another, unseen layer of reality.